These are the 5 countries with the largest petroleum reserves in the world. Today, the existence of petroleum cannot be separated from our daily activities. Since the 18th century, the world changed when petroleum was introduced as an energy source. The fields of industry, transportation, and power generation have developed rapidly and have direct implications for human progress in modern times. Unfortunately, petroleum is a non-renewable energy source that will run out within a certain period of time. Although it will run out someday, the search for petroleum is still ongoing. In fact, we can now estimate how much petroleum reserves are still in the earth and waiting to be extracted. According to Investopedia, it is estimated that petroleum reserves are at 1.73 trillion barrels spread across various regions in the world. Well, from the number of petroleum reserves, there are at least 5 countries whose petroleum reserves are above average. Interestingly, the countries with the largest consumption of petroleum today, namely the United States, China, and Russia, are not included in the list of the top 5 countries with the largest oil reserves in the world. Then, what are the countries with the largest petroleum reserves in the world? 5. Iraq. Iraq covers an area of 438,000 square kilometers and is home to around 41 million people. When it comes to producing energy resources, Iraq has long been known as one of the biggest contributors in the world. Apart from oil, other energy sources, such as natural gas, sulfur and phosphate, are also produced by this Middle Eastern country. Unfortunately, Iraq's domestic political conditions and repeated conflicts have prevented the country from maximizing its natural potential for the benefit of its people. In fact, according to OPEC records, Iraq has oil reserves of 145 million barrels or about 8.4% of all current oil reserves. Not only that, the country's natural gas reserves are also estimated at 3.7 billion cubic meters. 4. Canada. If you thought that the United States would represent North America as the country with the largest petroleum reserves in the world, you'd be wrong. Canada, the neighbor of Uncle Sam's country, has petroleum reserves that far surpass other countries in North America. This is quite reasonable considering that Canada's 9.9 million square kilometers area and 38.25 million inhabitants certainly stores so many natural resources. In Natural Resources Canada's records, the country has petroleum reserves of around 168 million barrels or around 9.7% of all petroleum reserves in the world. Interestingly, about 164 million barrels of petroleum reserves in this country are in the form of oil sands. In addition to its abundant reserves, Canada is also actually one of the largest crude oil exporters in the world. With a production of around 8.54% of world exports, Canada is the 3rd largest crude oil exporter in the world. 3. Iran. The 3rd position is occupied by Iraq's neighbor, Iran. The country with an area of 1.6 million square kilometers and a population of 84.9 million is ranked as the 7th largest oil producer in the world. Interestingly, petroleum is not Iran's only source of income. It is known that minerals such as coal, copper, iron, chromium, manganese, zinc, lead, and sulfur can be found in large quantities in Iran. Meanwhile, for the estimated oil reserves owned by Iran, OPEC recorded a figure of 208.6 million barrels. With this figure, it means that Iran has a proportion of at least 12% of all current oil reserves. In fact, natural gas reserves in Iran are also one of the largest in the world. A total of around 33.9 billion cubic meters of natural gas is still spread throughout the country. 2. Saudi Arabia. Another Middle Eastern country that makes this list is Saudi Arabia. This country with an area of 2.15 million square kilometers and a population of 35.95 million is already known as one of the largest oil producers in the world. In addition, resources such as natural gas, gold, copper and iron can also be found in Saudi Arabia. Reported by OPEC, Saudi Arabia's total petroleum reserves amount to 267 million barrels or about 17% of the total petroleum reserves worldwide. In addition to having abundant reserves, Saudi Arabia is also able to produce 12 million barrels of oil per day. This figure makes the country the second largest oil producer in the world with a percentage of about 13% of the total global daily production. 1. Venezuela. Not from the Middle East or North America, this South American country is the champion. With an area of 916 square kilometers and a population of around 32 million, it turns out that Venezuela is the biggest treasure box for the most needed resources today. In fact, apart from oil, Venezuela also produces various minerals, such as iron, gold, diamonds, and bauxite. According to OPEC, Venezuela's petroleum reserves are at 303.4 million barrels or 17.5% of the world's total petroleum reserves. Interestingly, despite having such large oil reserves, daily production in Venezuela only touches 750 to 850,000 barrels per day. However, this figure is projected to rise to 1 million barrels per day given the recent lifting of sanctions from the United States against Venezuela. Although petroleum is essentially a non-renewable energy source, all of our needs in this modern era must be closely related to this source. With the large amount of oil reserves that the above countries have, at least the supply for the world can remain available for decades to come. However, we still have to try to find solutions in order to release dependence on petroleum and switch to environmentally friendly energy sources.